Yes, we're talking about substituting renewable energy for fossil fuels, but at some level or other, I think it's Association for the Study of Peak Oil, Colin Campbell, who made a rule of thumb estimate that the equivalent energy that we get from modern energy supplies is the equivalent of the work of 22 billion people. The moment you start to remove fossil fuels from the equation, you replace that with other forms of energy. And one of the forms of energy you replace it with is that we get off our asses again and start doing things for ourselves. We walk and we cycle instead of going in one of the most inefficient forms of transport ever imagined, the car. We create work. I mean, both Carolyn and I were part of a group called the Green New Deal, in which we imagined a transitionary phase, which included everything from financial re-regulation of the banks, to creating something of a parachute for the recession-hit economy by investing counter-cyclically in a green transition to the economy. Now, the positive thing, I think, with this, the combination of overwork and high levels of structural unemployment, means that there's not a single push-button solution, but a combination of substituting green energy, of recognising a lot of the work that goes on in the economy informally and unpaid, such as a large amount of care work and all the rest of it. And I'm always slightly suspicious when we start talking about periods of full employment, because actually in the economic literature, when people talk about periods of full employment, what they usually mean is historical periods of full male employment, and they kind of just ignore and forget the fact that the workforce has been maintained by an unpaid female workforce. So I look forward to the world that Keynes imagined in his essay on an economics for the economic possibilities of our grandchildren, one in which we don't have to spend as much time in paid work, but there's more time for us to be citizens, neighbours, friends, family members, people who can spend time doing the things that we like to do. And I think in that world, A, there's enough work to go around, B, you create a society which is far more convivial and resilient, and C, it enables us to kick the fossil fuel habit. So I don't see there being a contradiction.
Thanks. Adrian, does that answer the question?
More or less, yes. If I could just follow up by, well, if there is, I mean, in the short term, surely there would be a lot of economic growth in the transitionary period. And I was just wondering how you relate to that. I mean, when does the growth stop, so to say? How will it stop?
Well, I mean, it depends, actually. I don't know if that is the case. It depends on what happens with other forms and patterns of consumption. And interestingly, if you want an interesting kind of historical parallel, Keynes was faced with this problem around spending during the wartime, and in fact, perversely, because there was such big effort, he was worried about inflation, but at the same time as needing to conserve resources and achieve consumption cuts. But there was also the problem about there was maybe potential for surplus expenditure in some areas, but not in others, because we had to make massive cuts for food security reasons, blah, 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 blah. Not until you actually start, I wouldn't jump to any conclusions, not until you start actually doing it. I mean, I think one of the reasons is that we're not talking about continuing, well, I'm not talking about continuing the same form of market economy where your ability to consume is only constrained by the amount of money you've got to spend. I mean, I think you actually do need to intervene. If you're going to hit a carbon reduction target, you actually have to have serious caps and reduction targets. And once you do that, opportunities for certain kinds of expenditure expire. Decommodified expenditure, one of the things which happened during the war, as people were consuming much less at the household level, they were spending more on entertainment, more on partying, more on having a good time. Actually, they were spending more on public transport as well, redirecting expenditure and money to the areas of the economy where it needed to go. So I think we don't know that until we try.
Thanks. And Caroline, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I could just carry on a little bit from where Andrew just left, because I think as well, trying to sort of think, well, when does the growth stop, as if you put a red ring around the diary on the date, so that's when it will stop. I don't think it works like that. And as Andrew said, if we're serious about carbon budgets, then it seems to me that to make that the context in which you're working, then following that back down, it probably means looking at measures like some kind of personal carbon quotas, or sometimes it's called carbon rationing. People don't like the word rationing, but I like to point out that actually, you know, carbon oil is rationed already. It's just rationed by price rather than by any kind of fairer mechanism. But if we had something like that whereby, for example, you'd have almost like a parallel currency, which would be around carbon, and each time that you were filling up the car with petrol, for example, you wouldn't only pay in money, you'd also have a certain number of your permits docked off your total. And there are ways, that's another subject, but there are ways of making that a very progressive policy too, because in the short term you could have people using fewer of those permits, selling them if they didn't need them to people who wanted more, and so you can actually redistribute money through that system as well. But it's that, I think, it's that kind of contraction that's managed in that way is what we're talking about. And then on the global scale, there's contraction and convergence where other poorer countries are allowed to and then enabled to grow a bit more so that we can then get to something more like some kind of global equity. On the actual question you asked me on the shorter working week, I mean, I'm delighted to hear about the proposals in Sweden. I don't know if one of those was the Swedish Green Party. They're a very nice, good Green Party, excellent. And so, as you would imagine, I completely support it. I mean, I think some of the difficulties that we face in terms of introducing some of these policies when you don't have a nice white piece of paper where you're kind of redesigning it and starting again is about those transitions that you talk about. I mean, you know, in the Green Manifesto, if you like, what we would have as well as shorter working weeks would be things like a citizen's income, which would be a basic income paid of everybody as of right, which would be about the level of the minimum wage now, and it would be something that you could live on, not at a wonderful level, but nonetheless you would have that, and then you could opt in and out of other parts of work, paid or not paid as you chose, without losing that. That would be like your bedrock, so you wouldn't be in the kind of benefits trap that we're in today. So I think that, you know, ultimately that there are very good ways of making sure that people wouldn't lose out hugely unless they're the very rich people who probably would, but we want to have some redistribution anyway, so that's not a bad thing. I accept the fact that introducing it more on an incremental level is more difficult, and I think we will have to use the tax system in such a way to make sure that those on lowest incomes were not losing out, that we'd have to compensate them through the tax system, but people on much higher incomes, I think that, you know, there would be more of a redistribution through the system.
One small PS, and I don't want to get involved in a game of one-upmanship with Swedish society, but NEF published a report called 21 Hours, which works through the case of having a shorter working week. So I don't know if anybody wants to raise the bidding on less than 21 hours. But.
Great, thanks. One more question from up there, and then we have one and two.
Thank you. My name's David. I'm a graduate student at Sussex. I had a question to both the speakers, actually, about referring to what Andrew said about the historical examples of where political will really managed to change with sort of the society within a short period of time, like in Cuba and the UK during the war. And I was just saying, like, how do you think the sort of global political economy that we have today, sort of globalization is happening today, would sort of hinder that and almost make that more difficult? So even if there would be strong political and public will within one countries, the sort of global economy and the global, especially sort of multinational companies and stuff like that, would they really interfere with that?
And that's to Andrew, is that right? Both. Okay.
I mean, but the obvious answer is, well, yes, they are. We're talking particularly about the tier of multinational. Well, there's two things really, I suppose. One is finance, which we're wrestling with in major ways at the moment, and you can barely turn on the TV without seeing another serried rank of bankers threatening to leave the country if we dare so much as, you know, take 5 pence out of their 10 million bonus package, and the same with multinational companies who, with their ability to transfer price, etc. There's huge swathes of the global economy which is beyond the ability of individual governments to directly control at the moment. But there's also large parts of it which are. And we are engaged in the process at the moment. And I think we're in a very interesting moment economically when it's down to us really to call the bluff of several of these countervailing forces, like the financial community. And I think actually, in a funny way, we're really quite close to that. When you have people like Mervyn King, Governor of the Bank of England, standing up and questioning the very basis of fractional reserve banking, the basis which allows the economy to grow in the way that it does, to live beyond its means financially and ecologically. Adair Turner, former head of the CBI, similarly questioning these things. And it is still within the realms of national governments to control quite a lot of what goes on. So I think we're at that kind of, what's that lovely word? We're kind of at a moment of bifurcation at the moment, where we've seen cracks in the system. Those cracks have been acknowledged by many of the people who were at the heart of designing the system. And yet, a little bit like kind of alien skin, the system's trying to kind of heal itself over and go back to business as usual. And I think the only thing that will stop it doing that, the only thing which will keep the political space for different imaginings of the economic system open, is people like you in this room, and hopefully people like us up here. I think we're the active agents of whether or not which path we go down, and I think it's all to play for.
To add to that just a little bit, I guess that the sort of parallel area of work that needs to be done is to work out how bits of the economy could be relocalized. And going back to Keynes, he was a great internationalist, and he said, all kinds of relationships should rightly be at the international level, but let finance be primarily national, was his line. Now, we've got a long way to go to begin to unravel some of that, but some of it does come down to political will. And so, for example, when you've got multinational companies who are refusing to keep within the regulation of a particular country, they will often threaten to go and relocate somewhere else if you don't bow down and take away whatever regulation you might have been about to introduce. It wouldn't be that difficult to design some kind of policy based around a site here to sell here policy. In other words, if you want to sell your widgets in this country, you will jolly well have a factory making those widgets here, and it will keep to these regulations. Otherwise, you're out and you lose your market as well. Now, obviously, the size of that market would differ whether or not you're talking about very small widgets or whether you're talking about huge aircraft or something. But the point being that there's nothing inevitable about the economic globalization that we've seen. It has been precisely and deliberately driven by financiers who have basically got politicians over a barrel and said to them, we'll have a great time and you do this for us, please. And they just changed the rules of the World Trade Organization. Those rules were made by politicians, and they can be changed by politicians if there's a bit more political will. So I think we do need to relocalize the economy to make it easier for countries to make decisions in their own interests. And it was one of the reasons, for example, that the Greens were actually very much against the single currency, as indeed the Swedish Greens were too, in the sense that if you want to be able to have real influence over your own national economy, you're not going to do it if you give away some of the key levers around interest rates, for example, and give that to a body that is trying to make the right rules that will be simultaneously appropriate in 25 different member states. I mean, it's just not reasonable to think that what's going to suit Greece on one day is going to be exactly the same as something that's going to suit Finland. It just doesn't make logical sense. And so I think, as well as the measures that Andrew was talking about, I think we need to look at other ways in which we could try to relocalise the economy in order to have more control over it.
One very particular piece which emphasises the political nature of this, when questions of tax and regulatory arbitrage are concerned and downward pressure on regulatory standards, actually, as it stands at the moment, for all the huff and puff of our own government, we are holding down international standards. We're the laggards in the system as people are trying to establish more global standards to prevent this. Britain presides over and has a degree of regulatory control over a wide range of tax havens. We've been arguing against what has been trying to be achieved at the EU level about pushing things around commodity speculation, for example, etc., etc., etc. So there's a number of ways in which that happens. Also, I think we have to have the self-confidence to call people's bluff, especially around banking. The next time, the CEO of HSBC or something stands up and threatens to leave the country, I think we should line up an offer to drive them to the airport, because there's reasons why they're based here. And actually, where retail banking is concerned, the useful day-to-day banking that small businesses and you and I need, we're not going to leave because we're here. We're the customers. In most instances, those who are threatening to leave are on the damaging investment side. And, it was kind of John Kay, the guy who writes for the FT, who pointed out that where that kind of speculative investment activity is concerned, these guys, these bankers who had signs in their offices which said, let's make nothing but money, ended up destroying more value than they ever created. So let the buggers go.
Question down here first, if that's okay. Here in the middle.
What is it, a bugger?
That's right.
Hi, thank you. My name's Hannah. I'm doing the Masters in Climate Change and Policy here. I also adopted Caroline last year as part of the
You
UK
did?
Youth Climate Coalition Adopted My Key campaign. So hello, Caroline. See you again. Yeah, my question is that it's looking quite likely that there are going to be protests or riots around rising fuel prices quite soon, if not this year, but that could be quite a key point in terms of what you were saying, Caroline, in terms of communicating these issues about overconsumption, but also incredibly tricky point as well when everyone's going to be so angry and emotional about it. So how can we go about, what's the message when it comes to that point? How can we almost preempt that, and I would say try and direct the conversation before that even happens so that it doesn't just run away in the opposite direction?
I think that's a really good question, and it'll be a real litmus test, really, of Cameron's government. He's come to government saying they're going to be the greenest government ever, and that's not a very ambitious aspiration, it has to be said. It's not very difficult, but nonetheless, for a government that aspires to come to that kind of reputation, they cannot and should not be backing down on this issue. However, you're quite right to say it's a deeply sensitive issue and people are feeling as if they're struggling massively. And so I really agree with you about kind of preempting it and talking about the fact that from the green perspective, what we want out of environmental taxation is not just a net burden, an increased burden of taxation on people, but actually a shift of taxation away from income tax or national insurance, let's say, and onto environmental taxation, which is precisely why I think a really good preemptive move would be to say, we are going to go ahead with this environmental tax. These are the reasons we're going to go ahead with it and talk about all the things we've been talking about just now. But then get rid of that VAT increase, that 2.5% extra increase in VAT, which will hit the poorest far harder in terms of the overall impact of that than the increase in fuel ever would. But the increase in fuel actually sends a political message, not only to individual consumers to say it is worth, if you can do it, to begin to shift to different patterns of behaviour, but also to business, so that business is serious and can understand that actually this is a government that's serious about green issues and isn't going to change the rules again in a couple of seconds, as they just have done on feed-in tariffs, for example, or at least they're just about to, so that the businesses can invest knowing that the price of oil is going to go on upwards. Therefore, it makes good business sense as well as good environmental sense to start investing in alternatives.
Great. We have a question over here. Any other questions? Loads.
Lots.
Brilliant. Okay. 1, 2, 3. I'll try and remember those.
I'm Alex. I'm a project manager at the Open University in sustainability. And my question is more for Caroline, but can be for both actually. It's Caroline, when we're talking about a more fair distribution of working hours, right? Like to have people working more and people working less with a huge youth unemployment that we have in the world in general. It's quite difficult in today's world for young people to find a way to use their talent and to drive their passions in the job, and they get pretty boring jobs when they start, or they go for other monies. Like I'm coming from a French business school, and I'm working at the Open University in education, but 99% of my friends are working in the financial sector because this is where they get money, and I decided not to choose to follow the masses because of my inspiration, my passion, but that's an individual action that I did. And do you believe that this kind of change that needs to happen about redistributing the work in the society have to happen from individual drive in a very small scale like mine, or should be done something from the government in terms of politics and decision making and making the educational sector maybe more attractive and less for the financial one through different systems? So that's the first part of the question. And the second part would be more in the global scale, as the UK being just a small entity in the global world in terms of affecting this. And with globalization and mobility of young people today, even if the UK take a strong stand on that, then the young talents here are going to live abroad, are going to go somewhere else, and the attractivity of the growth, economical growth and financial sector will always exist maybe somewhere else. So how to come to a solution in a global scale to this also? Thank you.
Right, it's quite difficult, isn't it? Well, the first bit of your question about whether or not it's enough for everybody to try and do it on an individual level, or whether or not we need government to put in place a policy framework to make it easier for people to do it, Well, I think the latter, because I think that people will need support networks in order to be able to do it. A few very rich people may be able to nip down to a 2-day week now, but not many of us can. Therefore, we need to have that policy framework. And maybe Andrew can say a bit more about the thinking that went into the NEF report on the 21 hours, because I know that a lot of work went into how that would actually work in practice. I mean, you're certainly right to say that almost anything that we're talking about today, would be an awful lot easier if it were being done on a wider scale, which is why I think that there is a role for the EU in this, for example. I mean, the EU in many ways goes in directions that are not positive to this agenda, in the sense that it's very much captured by big business interests, and there's lack of transparency, and the single market tends to trump everything. But having said all of that, actually there's the potential within the EU, which makes it such an exciting institution in a sense, for them to be able to put environment first. And there are good people working in there who absolutely see that as the role of the EU right now, to be the body that will try to take a lead in shifting to a way of life that has a much less heavy footprint on the planet. So I totally accept your point that all of these measures would be far more effective working at EU level. And there's some cause for optimism. I mean, just earlier this week, it was the European Parliament that voted overwhelmingly, but not with British Tory support, for a Robin Hood tax. They absolutely voted for it and said that's what we should have. And that was parties from, right across the spectrum in 27 different member states. So there are some positive signs there, but certainly it would be easier if we work together. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, when we talk about, when we sort of floated the idea of a much shorter working week, we talked about it in terms of establishing a new social norm. And that's in recognition of the fact that over the course of the last 100 and 150 years, the amount of time that people expect to work during the day, during the week, has continually changed. I mean, it's been one of the major objectives and achievements of the labour movement to reduce the length of the working week. And it's interesting in the French example that even though some of the legislation has been rolled back there, actually, from what I understand, many of the companies involved, because it was actually popular, have kept it, and many of the people are keeping to that shorter working week. And so when we describe it as being a new social norm, we understand that it's something like, as was said, you cannot introduce overnight, because there are certain core costs which lock people into working for a certain amount of time, a certain length of time. These are overwhelmingly housing costs and mortgage costs. So when we did the report, it's simply called 21 Hours, do download it off the website. We go through a range of innovations about ways in which, through reforms around land ownership, through sort of mixed-use, shared ownership schemes, you can start to look at ways to free people up so that they can afford to work for a shorter amount of time. Now, at the same time as greater levels of equality reduce social costs, actually having more time to do things for yourself can actually reduce significantly individual costs, and you can start to do things for yourself that perversely otherwise you would have had to work to pay to do. I mean, Ivan Illich, 30, 40 years ago, did a beautiful example about how embedded in the modern working pattern in advanced industrialized countries, you work a substantial amount of your time in order to be able to pay to travel to get to work, because of the way that we've consciously and deliberately redesigned the workplace. So I think there's many things which can start to free up space to allow us to do that. But then if you can begin to do that, instead of getting on a kind of a negative downward spiral, you can get on a positive upward spiral, and things can positively self-reinforce.
Great, thanks very much.
Oh, a PS, sorry, PS. To your second point, there is always this issue about whether countries should act unilaterally, and if acting unilaterally and making changes, they lose out. I find this absolutely fascinating, because this argument is used throughout history to oppose every progressive development. It was one of the main arguments used against Britain abolishing slavery. We would lose out in that earlier wave of globalisation to international competition. But we did it, and we did it because it was the right thing to do. It was the same set of arguments that were used against the introduction of safety measures in shipping, the introduction of the Plimsoll line, that Britain, as our seafaring was the very core of our global success as an economy, and there was a massive argument that we should not have shipping that was safe for sailors. But through agitation, parliamentary action, and mass mobilisation, those arguments were won. So every time you hear that argument, it's usually just a stalling device.
waiting for a PPS.
Don't let it be, Will.
So there was one more question over here, I think. The hand has gone down though, so we've got one in the middle here, and then we'll move up to the corner up there. So in the middle here, please. Back here.
Andrew Mailing. The question I think is probably sort of larger one, because I think, you know, so we're addressing the problem, but what we're lacking is well, basically have a new infrastructure sort of problem. So we don't have anybody sort of, as a sort of large organisation which its primary incentive is climate change. Well, we have politicians who sort of work in a 5-year cycle, and just by the end of that 5-year cycle, you know, they want to be elected again. So, but climate change is a much longer problem. So addressing the short-term problems are always going to be the imperative of politicians. So we talk about things like the budget. You know, so this is supposed to be a growth budget, but it's a growth budget which becomes a metaphor, but which says growth equals good, so it's much the alleviation of the current hardship. It's all all the other problems which don't go around it. You know, so addressing things like pension problems and so on. We don't have an infrastructure, you know, or a body, in a sort of a political body who has a primary incentive of actually addressing sort of climate change. Without that, I think, you know, sort of the problem will never be addressed. We're basically at the position, you know, sort of a group of people who sort of modern days is regarded as sort of here today, gone to tomorrow people who, you know, we will forget in the future, who will not sort of won't have the health responsibility, and without that, this will never get addressed, basically.
Any comments?
So you should be. I mean, I take your point that it makes it an awful lot more difficult to address the problems, and the government's made it even more interesting in terms of addressing these problems by abolishing some of the bodies that actually did exist. So the Sustainable Development Commission has actually been doing some fantastic work. I mean, they commissioned the work from Tim Jackson on prosperity without growth. And after the government came to power saying they were going to be the greenest government ever, the first thing they did was to abolish the very body that might have been able to measure whether or not they had any chance of becoming the greenest government ever, which was very convenient. So we've got a government with a kind of slash and burn approach to those very institutions, things like the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, the Carbon Trust, the Energy Savings Trust. Both of those are also going to be not abolished, but having their number of workers slashed. So it makes it a lot harder. I mean, the one thing that we do have, and this is an unusual tribute to the last Labour government, which I shan't repeat, but they did set up the Climate Bill, which turned into the Climate Act, and there is now a legislative act which is answerable to Parliament rather than to government, which is supposed to draw up carbon budgets, and I mean, it doesn't have the leverage we'd like it to have. It can't completely overrule governments, and maybe that's a good thing, because in all of this, the balance between democracy and urgency is a difficult one, and I think we should err on making sure it is democratic as well. But the Climate Committee that oversees the Climate Act potentially has quite a lot of influence. The sad thing is that, unfortunately, the targets that they're working to and the timetables that they're working to aren't really the right ones. They're not ambitious enough. But it's not to say that if you wanted to create a body, again, sorry to be boring, but if the political will were there, you could put more democratic controls into that climate change committee, and you could give it therefore more powers, and you could try and change the targets it was working to try to get to the place where you would have that kind of continual messaging that you're talking about. But it's not easy. Thoughts?
I'm not going to add to that, no.
I mean, if there's a follow-on to that, the answer would be democratic to who? Because yes, we need democracy, but is it democratic for people now, or is it democratic for people in the future?
Well, that's a
very good question.
So good that I think we're
to move on quickly.
No, I mean, it's true. I mean, the voice. I mean, it is a seriously important question. I mean, in terms of our conception about what equality is about and what democracy is about, the big bit that is missing is exactly the point that you put your finger on, future generations. And there is no real way of incorporating that into decision-making that goes on today. And it's interesting that many Green Party election broadcasts and others, for example, have precisely used young kids and others to be able to say, wait a minute, when you're making these decisions, please bear in mind it's actually us that are going to be living with the consequences of the decisions that you're making, and we don't yet have a voice. was about to say, we're in favour of bringing the voting age down to 16. I mean, we can't give people votes who don't exist yet. But we need to think of a way of having that perspective in there in a very serious way, because the point that you indicate is important.
Or I will say something.
I thought you would.
Well, in the sense that there are things which we should not conflate, and that there is democracy and there is freedom, and freedoms are often conflicting and contested. So I always think it's kind of hilarious, these kind of ginger groups that grow up in some areas, about the Freedom to Fly coalition. I don't even know if it exists anymore. But whenever I heard that sort of chorused, I would think, well, what about the freedom of people living on low-lying small island states in the South Pacific to have a home, to have a nation, to have a future? And when we raise the question of intergenerational equity, who are we to deny the future to those people? And I think we have an incredibly, with the sole exception of Caroline herself, an incredibly impoverished democratic system. And we're going through this process of the most mild attempt to enhance our democratic procedures in the UK through the AV debate that we've ever seen. I mean, I think it just requires such a shakedown that the level that we start from, the quality of the democracy that we enjoy at the moment, is so impoverished that I find it hard to defend its particular incarnation against the challenge and the threat of denying future generations the ability to exist in some cases. So I think you kind of up the ante ultimately with that point, and I think that's something that needs far more debate about exactly how you can deal with the paradox of having to represent the interests of future generations without them being here. And that's an interesting
I think
challenge.
One of our policies, if I'm right, if there's any Green Party policy people here, they might correct me, but I've got a feeling that we did have a policy that was...
where do we put it?
Down the back of the sofa it is. No, I think we've talked about having a ministerial position around precisely intergenerational equality and equity, which would be a voice that would be screening all of the policies that we're going through to look at, well, what would the impact of this policy be in 50 years and 150 years and so on. I mean, obviously there's limits to the extent that you can roll that out, but just to make that point, I think is a massively important one. And there should be someone there who's thinking beyond a 5-year timescale.
Great question. We've got another person up there. Can you stand up? Go with the dark hair.
Hi there. I'm Vera. I work for the Food Partnership promoting food waste reduction. And I don't know if this is so much a question as I'd like you guys to sort of comment on this. What I'm saying is there's really, in the past few years, definitely a growing movement of both politicians and individuals, communities, really clamoring for addressing environmental issues on a political level. What I'm also seeing in the past few years that I find really interesting is, well, both here and in the States where I'm from, we're having budget cuts, job losses. There's a growing group, communities, entire communities, industries of people really angry, losing their jobs, and they're also really angry. And so I see the issues that we're talking about here as affecting both of these big issues. And I think, oh, I'm really nervous. I'm usually much more calm when talking in public. So what I would love to hear you guys talk about is how we can unify these movements, because I think these movements are dealing with the same issues, a broken system that is not only denying us our basic rights, but also harming the environment. And I think for many of us here, I'm assuming many of us here who are going up to London on March 26th, it would be really great to hear some messages. Perhaps are there politicians, people in Parliament, sort of that are kind of creating relationships on both the environmental and the anti-cuts movements that we can talk about? What are some messages that we can take that can really galvanize our two movements together for a more powerful voice?
Really good point, and I think you're absolutely right that in a sense it is that insecurity, environmental insecurity or economic insecurity that are absolutely linked. And I think the good news is that in the UK at least there has been increasingly more and more talks between the trade unions, for example, on the one hand, and the environmental movement in its broader sense in the other, and more joint work. And so, for example, that report that I talked about a moment ago, that 1 million green jobs, I mean, that was a real landmark report, because 10 years ago, it was really seen to be a tension between the Green movement and the unions, because green issues at that point were really being perceived as a threat to jobs in a way that they're not now, I think, in the same way. I mean, in certain sectors there will be, nuclear power, for example, or aviation, but overall, I think the case to be made around the fact that there are far more jobs in a green economy, it's a far more jobs-rich economy than the fossil fuel economy, is a very compelling one. And the kinds of messages that we were working up around this Green New Deal that Andrew was talking about earlier, which was basically the number of jobs you'd get if you had a massive investment in renewable energies, energy efficiency, the kind of infrastructure that we urgently need for this 21st century challenge of getting ourselves off the collision course that we're on with climate change. All of that is massively jobs-rich. I think where the challenge is now, though, is that although it's really quite easy to make the broader picture, to say, yes, more jobs in a green economy, the future's going to be better. It comes back to what we've been saying earlier about that transition. What about my job, my life here and now? And I think we've got to get much better at looking at some of the examples that have already existed around transition. Because, for example, there was a case back in the 60s or the 70s where there were aerospace workers, Lucas aerospace workers, and their factory was used as a real case study, lots of work done on it, about how you would readjust the skills, the very real skills of those workers and the real technologies in that factory to make it something more socially useful. And it was actually about what training specifically would these workers need and what extra adaptation would this factory need to be producing something else. And I think until we can get down to that level of detail and granularity and reality, if you like, then it's going to be harder to completely make that link between the green agenda and the Labour agenda. But I think it's much, much better than it was. And there certainly are far more discussions going on in Parliament, you know, between, for example, Labour politicians, Green politicians, or the Labour movement and the Green movement. You know, for example, I'm the Vice President of the Parliamentary All-Party Group for the PSC Union. PCS Union, rather, sorry, Palestine Solidarity Group and the Public Services. Anyway, so basically the Greens are more and more in those places too, which I think can only be a good thing.
I mean, I'd just add a couple of things to that, in that there are some good initiatives at the moment where a lot of these issues are increasingly coming under the same umbrella. They're not, no individual one is the answer in every way, but the growth of the Transition Town movement is bringing issues of food security and energy security and job creation and quality of local place together under one roof, and it's been called one of the fastest growing social experiments in this country. You've got people increasingly, a whole new generations of people coming to activism through UK Uncut, for example. And when I say new generations, I don't necessarily mean people who are young, but it's introducing whole new demographics of people into getting active and standing up and speaking out and doing it in a creative and light touch way, which is expanding the political space for action. You've got some quite good detailed work. One of the other reports that came out from the Green New Deal group that we're both part of pointed out that if you took 10 billion quid, you know, a tiny fraction of the level of support that was thrown at the banks, you could retrain 1.5 million people. And generate a substantial number of new jobs in addition to paying for retraining. A nice piece of work done by a guy called Stuart Wilkinson, who's part of the Scientists for Global Responsibility, which is the kind of UK version of the American organisation, the Union of Concerned Scientists. He's looked in detail at pound for pound, dollar for dollar, how much you can get in terms of jobs by shifting investment from, I mean, economics sometimes unintentionally comes up with really brilliant terms, what's called unproductive expenditure, spending on arms and the like, and spending that instead on house building, home refurbishment, public transport, etc., etc., etc. And so that there is stuff out there, and I do feel that in a piecemeal and slightly patchwork way that these things are starting to coalesce. The only way they coalesce, it doesn't just happen. It happens through people getting involved and doing things. And I was just wondering, actually, are there any people who are just starting PhDs in the room here? I was just thinking, we've got about 4 or 5 years to turn this round. Just a thought. You know, just a thought.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for your questions. And before I hand over to River, I'd just like to thank our panellists Andrew and Caroline for coming along.